boy, this is a great big group. This is amazing. This is our third of our monthly, once a month talks that we've started this fall. My husband, Jason, is going to be talking about the anatomy of a watch. There'll be about an hour presentation, and then also at the bench, we've got a watch disassembled. You're welcome to take a look after the event at the bench and so forth, and stick around and ask lots of questions. We've got a nice little special that we'll announce at the end of the event today for all of you guys that are here. And there's coffee and donuts, so help yourself, make yourself at home, and enjoy and learn.
What? No. Okay. Well, this is interesting because this is by far the largest group that we've ever had. The purpose of these talks is just to give insight. There may be people, you guys may know a huge amount about watches, maybe you know a little bit about watches, but what this will do is it'll just kind of give you sort of a good foundation so everybody's kind of on the same page for it. Also, it's a barometer for what people want to hear and talk about, right? So our first talk that we did was something that was near and dear to my heart, which is case refinishing. 4 people turned out for it, but it wasn't sort of out there. Now people know this is starting to happen. You know, we'll do it again, and maybe some more people will turn up for it, and we'll start to see. The point is that you can guide the way in this, because ultimately this is going to be the beginnings of a horological society here in Vancouver. So this is what I want to see. It's not going to be about collecting necessarily. It's not going to be about flexing what's on your wrist. It's about learning and getting to know people that have a particular interest. The other thing is, you never know, I never know who I'm talking to who might actually like to change their path where they are to become perhaps a watchmaker or even perhaps a clockmaker, right? This is something that also is very near and dear to my heart because the industry is in crisis. I just did an interview with the Grey Nato podcast earlier on this week. It'll be aired on the 30th, I believe, because an article was written in Watchinista about this. The major problem with the watchmaking's watchmaker problem is that word about watchmaking isn't getting out there. We're not talking about it in schools. We're not talking about it in trade schools, BCIT, that kind of thing. So it's a lovely trade, and there's employment at the end of it. The British School of Watchmaking, for example, just made a very clear statement on their website. They're taking entrants for January, and they're like, you take this course, 100% guaranteed you will get a job in the industry, no problem. That's how desperate they are. So if you do have the time, go and check out Watchinista. It's a bit like Houdinki, but focused mostly on Europe. And you'll see an article, just put in watchmaking's watchmaker problem, and you'll start to see. But all of that, it all starts with a spark, a little spark. Someone says something to somebody else, and they start to take notice, perhaps of a watch or a clock. How many of you walk around the city and see clocks and actually truly think about it? How many of you actually look up to the tower clocks? Say the one at 736 Granville, right? I went in there a few months ago and took some pictures from the inside of that. It's absolutely amazing. I think it's still draped because they're doing a restoration on it. But when you do, look around for these things and pay attention to them and find out a little bit more about them, because it may spark absolutely an interest. But today, we're going to talk about the anatomy of a watch. This is something that I think a lot of people are really interested in, to get down to the nitty-gritty. I will say this though, if you're looking for me to talk about more complicated things and things like that, that will be another talk. This is going to be just about something simple, right? A simple time-only watch, and how does the mechanism work? Because that's how you have to start, right? Before adding complications and things like that. The basics, the very basics. 13th century, this is when clocks really started to appear. I want to start with clocks because you have to start with clocks, because it all started with clocks and miniaturization of it. In fact, probably even before clocks, it started with candles, people putting marks on candles to be able to understand the passage of time, right? But ultimately, people needed to know the time. Why did they need to know the time? They needed to know the time because, hey, you know what? It's all about prayer at that time, right? And clocks in the 13th century, there were no particular clockmakers. There were iron workers. It was blacksmiths that were making these things, which is really very interesting because blacksmiths were the early engineers, right? The very early engineers. And most clocks only had one hand. Only had one hand because nobody ever really thought that you would need to be able to break an hour into minutes. No one needed to be that precise at that time. It was ultimately the Industrial Revolution that really propagated that notion of actually having two hands, and then, oh my God, dates and everything else. But these clocks were very, very early blacksmith-made clocks, virgin foliate clocks. It's a particular type of escapement. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. And it wasn't until the 15th century, just moving on, that the mainspring was developed. A thin ribbon of steel that could be coiled up, that was found to be able to hold tension, that then things could start to be miniaturized. So as things moved along, miniaturization happened because people wanted personal timekeeping devices, right? And those people were people that could really pay for it. They were the aristocracy, they were kings, they were queens, right? And they would be ornately decorated as such. Harmonic oscillators happened in the 17th century. Christian Huygens released an engineering document on pendulums. Now, pendulums aren't exactly portable now, are they? You can't take a pendulum in a carriage. You can't take a pendulum on a horse. You can't take it on a boat, right? So really, those things are for static timekeeping only. And so this is where the problem then was, what do we do? What do we do if we can't use a pendulum? We figured out the whole weight thing for a clock, right? You've all seen clocks, you've all seen cuckoo clocks that have these cone-shaped weights, like tree cones, right? That are powering the mechanism. Now we're gonna get into powering the mechanism in a minute, just trying to give you an overview of it. But you can't make a pendulum keep time on a boat. This was the style of early clocks, and of course they had a bell on it because you'd need to be able to know when it was the top of the hour. Just like in clock towers that only had one hand, people knew from a distance what time it was because they could hear the bell chiming. It was a repeater. There was a massive jump from clocks to pocket watches, miniaturization, right? Portable clocks or watches were large and cumbersome. They were really big. They were called onions. The first portable clocks were like this big, okay? Using a mainspring, and a mechanism like this called a fusee. You can come and take a look at that in a minute. But ultimately, it was King Charles II that wanted to miniaturize it even further. King Charles II was really into fashion. He introduced the waistcoat. And in the waistcoat, there were pockets. Pockets were then used for pocket watches. This carried on all the way through until, well, through the 18th century, even to today. Those of you wearing jeans have a tiny little pocket just up here. And that is for a pocket watch. Try it. Find a pocket watch. It will fit in there really nicely. Most people don't know how to carry pocket watches these days. You've got to wear a chain, right, to hold it in place, but you don't. You can poke it down there far enough and it's not going to go anywhere. But ultimately, he wanted to be able to carry a personal timekeeping device. And so they made it for him. And this is what it kind of looked like. Watches like this started to be produced. Incredible enameling, right? Beautiful colors. It was art. So for the first time, ultimately, art and science came together in the watch. And this is why we see today so many of those types of pieces still. Everyone's like, wow, that's a cool dial. Look at that, it's beautiful. It's beautiful because of the art, right? No one, hardly anybody that doesn't know that much about watches, they don't go, oh wow, yeah, forget that dial, look at that movement. Oh, it's the movement. Those people that have glass backs on their watches, they're the people that look at that and just go, wow, this is fantastic. So pocket watches, very, very popular right up until the 1800s. But then whenever a need pops up, this is when engineering jumps in to be able to make the change. The change was war, ultimately. In order for a soldier to be able to fight, he needed both hands. Lots of gear, all of that. The First World War was the turn in the tide from pocket watches into wrist watches. And they weren't called wrist watches at that point, they were called wristlets. And they were pocket watches adapted for the wrist. This way, a soldier can have both hands free and still quickly be able to tell the time. It was all about speed. Here's the first, one of the first adverts for something like that. They were even using pocket watch technology in the form of hunters and half hunters. For those of you that don't know what a hunter and a half hunter is, it's all about the cover on the top and the back. So the cover on a watch like this is a half hunter, it's missing the glass, it protects the dial, right? But to protect it even more, it was metal, right? Early military watches had grids on them, right, to protect the crystal from being broken. But this was it. Looks very much like a pocket watch, right? They're even showing it as a pocket watch with the onion crown pointing up. So those people that were familiar with pocket watches didn't feel so strange about putting one of these things on the wrist, right? All these inventions to be able to make it smaller and smaller and smaller so that it's more portable. So remember the wristlet. Got a picture here. So this is a very early picture from World War I. I do believe that would be a German soldier. You can very clearly see the big thing he's got on his wrist there on a very thick Bund type strap, right? And of course a pipe. Watches, pipes, whiskey, scotch, all good stuff. Guy goes into a German watchmaker, not the German watchmaker, but a German watchmaker. and says, "Excuse me, but I'm listening to my watch and all I can hear is tick, 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 tick." German watchmaker picks up the watch. He goes, looks at it very closely, menacingly almost, perhaps. And he goes, "We have ways of making you talk." Now we've had the history lesson, let's get down to the nuts and bolts, bridges and screws. And look at what's inside. Yes, that is me, and yes, I do have 2 loops on there. So, there are 4 systems to a simple watch, and I've just broken it down this way. This may be, it's just my way of actually looking at it, right? Power. We need power. As we saw from the 15th century, mainsprings had been developed for this. They didn't know that in the 15th century, but the idea was to be able to miniaturize and not have to have weight. I can't imagine people walking around like this with weights hanging off of their watch, right? So power, we need power, and lots of it. Mainsprings are very powerful. You'll see one over here a little bit later, taken out. It's very long and it's very strong. Transmission. We need a way to be able to take that power that's stored up and put it through a gear train to distribute that. So this is the transmission aspect of the watch. In quartz watches, it's a little bit similar. I'll just dive into this. I was thinking about whether I should bring up quartz at this point, but it's exactly the same concept. Just in a quartz watch, for the power, you have a battery. You still have a gear train, right? Unless it's LCD, LED, and stuff like that. For an analog quartz watch, you still have a transmission. I've got another one for you. A man walked into a watchmaking store and he sees the watchmaker at the bench just beating this watch. And he goes, "Excuse me, why are you doing that?" He goes, "Well, it needed a battery." Dad jokes, I love them. Okay, now that we've got all of this power going through a gear train, we need to be able to regulate it. Regulate it so that time can actually be kept. So this is the third part of a watch, is to be able to keep time. To me, this is ultimately the most important part of a watch. And I think for most people, it's the most important part of a watch, because why do you wear it if it doesn't keep time? Well, unless you're going to flex, of course, and you don't set it or wind it or anything like that. People do that. I'm sure none of you guys do, but Mary, is your watch wound today? Oh, there we go. I can't tell you the number of times I just pop on a watch and I get down here and I'm like, what time? Oh, I haven't even wound it. Anyway, so there we go. So the regulation system, it's a very complex, very ingenious system, and we'll talk about that in a minute too. And then you've got to have a display system. This is where now it starts going into the art on the movement side, regardless of the case. Just to be able to go, wow, okay, I can tell the time. For military pieces, it has to be time at a glance. For pieces that are more focused on technology, maybe the hands and stuff like that can fall into the background a little bit, so you're showing more of the movement. Look at, for example, many Global Fortis watches, right? If any of you have heard of that company, if you haven't heard of that company, I'd suggest looking it up, and then you'll really start to see. Global Fortis is one of the few companies that has developed tourbillons, and tourbillons will be another talk that we'll be doing. And then you'll see, it doesn't really matter about the hands so much. Power in a mechanical watch comes from a mainspring. We've gone through that. It can be manually wound, or it can be wound automatically using a weight. So this is where watches took the concept of heavy weights from clocks to then be able to think about that and then go, well, if you've got heavy weights and that's doing the winding, why don't we have a weight in a watch that could possibly do the winding? That's on automatic watches. But for this, it's a very, very simple watch, like the one that's on the bench there. And when you wind it, you've got a number of gears that we'll talk about in a minute to be able to wind up that mainspring. So how does it not simply unwind? Well, sometimes they do, and that's a mechanical failure. And when it unwinds, if there's a mechanical failure, it unwinds very aggressively, and lots of damage can happen. Teeth are stripped, pivots are broken, all of that kind of stuff. So here you can actually see how it works. So ignore that bit for a moment, but look into the background here. You can see that thing chattering like that. It's a ratchet. So when you wind, this ratchet is into the teeth and it stops it from unwinding. It completely blocks it. So it allows one-way rotation only of the barrel, right? With a manual wind watch, there is an end to the mainspring. With an automatic watch, ultimately it's open-ended. There isn't an end. So, on a manual watch like this, like the one that's on the bench, you'll be winding it. You'll feel the tension getting more and more and more until the crown stops, right? You feel it, and it kind of pulls back a little bit. Then you know, yeah, the watch is fully wound. That's great. Some watches actually show that to you with the state of wind indicator, which is another complication, which is really neat. For those of you who want to see something like that, there's an Nomos Metro over there that has a state of wind indicator on it. So you can see throughout the day, like the gas gauge on your car, how low the mainspring is, how unwound it is. It's really nice. Doesn't make that much sense for an automatic watch, but it certainly makes sense for a manual wind watch. On an automatic watch, I said it was open-ended because when you've got a weight and it's doing the winding for you as you're walking around, that weight is falling because of gravity, it's turning some gears which is doing that winding.
So can an automatic watch do the wind itself?
No, it can't.
Is that like a free wheel that just lets it, if there's too much tension, it just lets it go?
Yeah, it lets it go. Yeah, there's a little clutch on it. And afterwards I can show you the two different types of mainsprings and you'll actually see the big difference between them. So one, the manual wind mainspring, as you wind it, as seen here, it's got a little hook on the end of it. So the metal is bent around and it meets on the wall of the barrel that it sits in, and it stops, and it's like a hook and it stays there. So as it's being wound, it's just more tension, more tension, more tension. With the automatic mainspring, as it winds, It's going to get to a certain tension and then slip to allow it to keep on winding. There is a fallacy out there. This term, overwinding. Can't do that to a watch. All you can do is break apart it. And mainsprings are supposed to be unbreakable, right? But they do break. You know, any bit of metal, if you flex it enough, is going to break. So over the years, with that mainspring winding up and letting down, winding up and letting down, it's losing its power. This is why, especially with vintage watches, we almost insist on changing the mainspring when we get the watch in for a service. Is because, hey, we don't want the watch coming back in 2 years because the mainspring is broken, or because there is reduced power going through the gear train, going through the transmission, and you'll see why in just a moment. So here's a closer picture of that click. So as you're winding the mainspring, whether it be a manual wind or an automatic, you still have the same click. And you see there's another spring there. This spring right here. This is what brings this tooth back into place. So as this winds, this is jumping over the teeth, and then when you stop winding, it pulls it back. And it's this spring that is pulling it back. So springs are everywhere, even in the simplest of mechanical watches. And it gets to a crazy level when you look at chronographs. We'll do a talk on chronographs, but the complications there and the need for springs there are intense. So, the transmission. The mainspring sits in a barrel which has teeth on it. The teeth on that barrel connect directly to the center wheel, the first wheel in the watch. Now, you can see here in this picture, this is a nomos movement. Forget these wheels here. This is not what I'm trying to show, because this is actually this is an automatic movement, and that's part of the winding gears for the automatic. What we're looking at here is this, that, and that, and maybe this. It's hard to see anyway, but here we go. Here's your barrel. That's got the mainspring in it. Here's the ratchet wheel. That's the part that click interacts with. And you see these teeth right here, they're really close to this wheel here. That's your center wheel. It's called a center wheel because it's at the center of the movement. That is what your minute hand is pressed onto. Now, I'm gonna preempt a question there. Well, what about watches with a center second, right? Well, it needs a few more wheels, at least one or two. And that center wheel at its center is bored out, so it's hollow. And so another wheel with a long shaft on it can actually go through that, then you can actually attach a second hand to. And that wheel would be driven by the third wheel, but let's not get too complicated here. Your center wheel takes the minute wheel, goes all the way through the main plate of the movement. The main plate of the movement is this. Now, what's really interesting about this is that is the foundation for any watch. That is the part that is clamped most firmly to a watch case, right? So you've got a ton of rigidity there, right? And as you can see right here, this is a screw that's holding the main plate to a movement ring. This screw here is where a little tab would actually slide into the case, and there would be a screw there too. So it's all very rigid. There's nothing moving in there at all. For those of you that came to an earlier talk, you would have heard me talk about a Bremont Martin Baker and vibration and how a watch can stop through vibration. Well, this is where this ring here would actually be made out of rubber because it's vibration dampening. Okay? So as the barrel turns, as it's been wound up, it is connected to the center wheel. The center wheel is connected to the third wheel. The third wheel is connected to the fourth wheel. How does that thing go? There we go. So this is what's happening here. All it is a very, very simple transmission, taking a lot of power and reducing it to a little power. Now, if this was fully wound and all these wheels were held in place by a plate that goes on the top, right, you could take this part out that stops this from moving and watch that wheel whiz. It whizzes so fast, right, you can hear it. You can hear it. So your center wheel is turning slowly, the third wheel's turning a little bit faster, the fourth wheel's turning even faster, and then the poor old escape wheel is just flying like crazy. The problem with that happening, though, is that if you allow that to happen, and you take what is stopping this gear train from spending all of its power that's stored up in the mainspring, and you just let it whiz down, you put a huge amount of wear onto the pivots. Remember, all of these wheels are held in place with a second plate on top of it that holds them straight. Those plates in more popular, on nice watches, Swiss watches, they all have jewels. Jewels are, okay, let me ask you this. Who knows what a jewel is? What's it made out of?
Synthetic ruby.
Synthetic ruby. What is that synthetic ruby? What's the material?
Aluminum with various additives.
Yeah.
Red ruby, blue.
Yep. So that's it. They used to be made out of rubies, right? That's why they were called jewels, because they were rubies. But that became a bit expensive, right? So they needed another material. Aluminium oxide is the material. Not aluminum, it's British, it's superior. So this is the thing. This cuts down on the friction. Friction is horrible for a wristwatch. Because when you think about it now, you've got a little bit of knowledge into this. You've got a lot of power here that's being transmitted through these. Now, if there's friction on any one of these points for the pivots, it's going to reduce the power. The power isn't going to flow nicely. And we want the least resistance we can have. So this is why there are jewels in a watch for those bearing surfaces. And this is why those jewels on top of that are lubricated. The lubricants used in a watch movement like this are really important because you don't just use one lubricant. One lubricant does not fit all. You need multiple viscosities of oil, right? You know when you get into your car and you go, wintertime, I'm going to use 5W30 or whatever, 10W30. Different viscosities of oil for the type of engine that you have. In a watch, it's different types of viscosities for different pressure points in the watch. You would not want a really heavy, thick oil down here because the gearing's been reduced, and this is, you can stop a watch really quickly right here with a feather, with a minuscule piece of dirt. Right at that point, will stop this immense power from getting through, right? So you need a heavier oil here and lighter oils here. So keep that in mind for a moment.
So one of those gears is attached to,
Yep,
but the other ones, their job is really to minimize how fast that flow.
that's right.
It's just to minimize its rate of. So is 4 the magic number? Like what's the magic number? Like what's the minimum we can have? Is every watch different?
Yeah, for every watch, the basic number is 4, right? The basic number is 4. So the barrel goes to the center wheel. So that's the first connection. All of these go wheel to pinion. Pinions have fewer teeth, but are there to take the power from the from the thing that was before it to be able to reduce it into the next wheel that would have more teeth and more teeth as you go through. So the center wheel to the third wheel to the fourth wheel to the escape wheel. The escape wheel is that wheel here that's got the funny teeth on it that look like the tip of Italy, like that soccer boot, right? Now here we go. Now you get him really, really close. You can see how fine those teeth go. The finer the teeth, the easier it is to stop. That is why dust is a killer, an absolute killer, and friction is a killer. So barrel, center, third wheel, fourth wheel, escape wheel. And you can see here a device called pallets. Now that's part of the regulating system. Again, this is just that same watch. They don't have to be lined up. They can be curved in order to condense the movement. So there are some cool watches that do have them all lined up in a bar shape, and then you have a glass to be able to see it because it's just so cool to look at, and it makes sense when everything is in line. Now for the magic. This is the part that is so fascinating, because everything else is just very, very, very coarse mechanics, right? A big spring to a gear train that, if you allow it to, it's just going to spin right out. All those wheels are just going to spin till there's no more power. So it's all let down. The regulation is done by the escapement. So this is so important. With great power comes even greater responsibility, because it is the escapement that gets you where you want, to your meeting on time. It is the thing that when you listen to your watch, and as long as you're hearing the tick and the tock, right, you know your watch is functioning, right, and it's going to be keeping time. And we'll talk about this. So the escapement releases the power to be able to give a precisely timed impulse to keep the balance swinging. Okay. Is it perpetual motion? No. It's close to it because of the mainspring is supplying power, but unless you have something other than the mainspring that is going to supply constant power, right, without the need of any intervention, you won't have perpetual motion, right? But that's it. All it's doing is being able to take the power from the gear train that's coming from the barrel and the mainspring, to then release it so you can keep another part swinging, right? Nomos called this their swing system, which is when I first heard it from them, I thought this is brilliant, because it really does help explain what's going on. If you talk about a balance, typically the first thing that people think of is a scale, right? Something like this, right? But here, swinging is what the balance does, and it's brilliant. I thought that was gonna move. There we go, yeah, thank you. So here you can see really, really closely what's going on. Remember, okay, up until this point, you've got all those wheels with a ton of power here. The pallets allow that power and regulate that power to come out in spurts, like one impulse. So if you look at the teeth, you can see this tooth is stopped by that jewel, then it moves to that jewel and it's stopped and then let go. And all of that is controlled here. So on the balance, there's another jewel. It looks a bit like a cylinder. It's a cylinder with half of it cut off. So it isn't perfectly round, it's got a face on it. So as the balance rotates or oscillates, you see it's coming into contact with this horn. And that is controlling how much of the power is coming out here. But more importantly, it's flicking that jewel, it's giving impulse to this jewel. And that is what keeps the balance swinging in conjunction with the hairspring. Remember I said springs are so important. This balance, if it didn't have a hairspring to begin with, just from a very rudimentary level, it would get an impulse and just swing to a point and then just kind of stop because there's nothing pulling it back. So the hairspring is instrumental in that. It pulls the balance back around. When you think about that for a second, the hairspring is so important in this case because it determines how fast this balance is swinging back and forth because of the pull to be able to receive an impulse, to go in the other direction, to be able to pull back, to be able to receive an impulse, to go in the opposite direction, right? So that hairspring, I can tell you, is absolutely what every watchmaker hates. Hate it because it has to be perfect. It has to be perfect. There is no way your watch is going to run well with a screwed up hairspring at all. More so for the watchmaker. When watchmakers are going through school, you have to make them. That's one thing that they have not cut out of the curriculum for watchmaking school, is how to make a hairspring, because it is that important. Because if you can make it, that means you can adjust it. And all companies are worried about is, can you adjust a hairspring so that you can make the watch run perfectly? Now, more about the balance here. The balance is a rotating device. Remember earlier, I'm gonna bring in a similarity here between the balance and an automatic watch that has a rotor. To be able to wind the watch, the rotor has to have a heavy spot so that it's pulled down with gravity, and that is rotating some gears that actually wind them into gravity. Gravity is the most important thing here, especially for this part. For regulation, gravity is everything, because this wheel is made out of metal. In the old days, and you'll see from this watch, there would be screws in the rim of the balance. More modern watches don't have screws. They tended to disappear in the late 40s, early 50s. The whole point of a screw is to be able to make sure that the balance is balanced. If a balance is not balanced, it's like taking a car into the mechanic and saying, I need new tires. If they just throw tires onto the rims and then just simply stick them back onto your car, you're going to get to a certain speed and you'll feel your steering wheel vibrating. And the more it's out of balance, the more that steering wheel is going to be vibrating like crazy, and you're like, what the heck? Because there is a heavy spot on a wheel, or more than one wheel, but because you're feeling it in the steering wheel, it's probably your front tires. There's a weight problem, a balance problem. The same thing with the balance here is that if it has a balance problem, let's just pick this tine here that's coming around. If that is heavier than the other two, or any spot on the balance rim, if it's got a heavy spot, gravity is going to act on it and is going to pull it down faster. If in one position the balance is traveling faster than other positions, what do you think might happen? Timekeeping indifference in that one position. This is why you see watches where they say adjusted to however many positions, 3 positions, 5 positions, 6 positions, right? It's the way the watch manufacturer is actually turning around to you and saying, yeah, you know what, our balances are well balanced. You don't have to worry. Because if it's not, oh boy, you're gonna see in one position a watch gaining and in another position a watch losing, right? That's what the timing machine is for. We can tell statically when a watch is in a static position what its rate is, move it, what its rate is, move it, what its rate is. And then from that we can determine where the heavy spot is on the balance. That's getting a bit more complicated, but then how do you think we deal with that? How do you balance a balance? You have to remove mass or add mass. How do you add mass to something like this that has no screws? How do you add mass to a watch that does actually have a screw or screws? And that's the position of how far in the screw is to the balance or how far out it is, right? It's some very, very basic physics involved there. Once you have the balance balanced and you know that it's good, then your hairspring comes into play. How fast is that watch supposed to tick? All of that is determined through the gear train. So when a designer, an engineer is actually making the design for a watch movement, is designing how fast it's going to tick and what the gearing needs to be able to keep that. The faster the watch ticks, the more accurate ultimately it's going to be. This is why quartz watches are far more accurate than mechanical watches, because the oscillating system in a quartz watch is a tuning fork. A tuning fork made out of quartz, that's why they're called quartz watches. And it vibrates really, 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 really quickly, right? So if there's any errors with your watch being knocked like this, it's not throwing the system off in any way because there are so many vibrations. Watches, high beat watches, 28,000, 21,000, to slow beat watches, 18,000 or 19,000, right? The spring here determines that. How long the spring is determines that. Any questions on that?
Yes, can you go back to that? Well, the blue is the escape wheel.
Yes.
It has teeth that are moving counterclockwise.
Yes.
In the center, there's an X that's moving clockwise, so it appears every so often.
The X is a bit of a glitch, it's a GIF, and it's just to have a GIF running for
Okay.
like 10 seconds is very hard, so.
Thanks.
It's an optical illusion, it shouldn't.
I just couldn't recognize.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, but this brings up a really good point, because if you look at the teeth and the teeth shape, they look like a boot. And that is just so that it can function with pallets the way that it does. Locking, sliding to locking. See, locking, sliding to locking. And this is how it works. And this is how it winds down and gives impulse. Right?
Oh, I just have a question. Why does it need to have coax seals?
Ah, that's getting too deep. Yeah, that's getting too deep. That will that will throw this completely off. But I'll talk about it later with you. Yeah, it does. It has an extra tooth on the escape wheel, on the pallets. Sorry, there's another jewel or piece of steel there, finger. So. All of this, it's very sensitive because you have a lot of power going through. Here you can see it again. You have a lot of power going through, and this is a weak point in the chain because a small amount of anything can stop it. The entire thing, even with a full wind on the mainspring, with all that power going through the gear train, the tiniest thing can stop this. Now, another invention here is the shock absorbing system. This was an incredible invention. So the balance is rotating. It's inside a moving time device, and we all have gone bang. We've all dropped our watches, and we all hold our breath at that moment, like diving into a cold pool, right? Like, oh my God, what have I just done? In pocket watches, early pocket watches, there was no shock absorbing system. So things would break. If you go back in your mind to that diagram I showed you with the gear train, going from the center wheel to third wheel to fourth wheel to escape wheel. The pivots on those wheels are getting smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller, or finer, right? So the finer the pivot is, the more easy it is to break or bend, right? And more often than not, it breaks. For the balance, this is even more important because there's the pivot right there, right underneath the red dot, sitting in the jewel. There was never a shock absorbing system. You drop a pocket watch, its staff, called the balance staff, that sits in between two bearing surfaces, would break. Watchmakers back in the 1800s were expert at replacing and making balance staffs. A balance staff is a very, 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 very hard thing to make. Check it out on YouTube. I'm sure you will find tons of videos on there on how balance staffs are made. And if you look at that and you think to yourself, how is that even possible? Because they're made by hand if somebody breaks it, especially in a pocket watch. It requires a very small lathe, and you've got to have very good manual dexterity to actually cut the steel by hand using a graver, which is the same thing that is used for engraving. So, the industry needed something groundbreaking, absolutely groundbreaking, something that was going to absolutely disrupt the industry so that these watchmakers didn't have to spend all this time manufacturing balance staffs. I had this idea once for something that would be absolutely so disruptive to the industry. I thought, okay, I got to tell somebody about this. And I sent it to this French watchmaker friend of mine. And he looked at my concept and he kind of said to me, Seiko killer, qu'est-ce que c'est? Fa 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 better. Sorry, that was the other joke. It's full and flat, but hey, anyway. These are the things that are absolutely groundbreaking because it reduces a technical issue with breaking staves. And it's held right in here. See this spring that looks like a bit like an hourglass? That is a spring that can flip up and it holds a jewel and a cap that covers the top of the jewel and it's held in place by a spring. That jewel and cap is in like a cup. The cup is called a chaton. And so the jewel is pressed into it with the jewel hole, and then you have a cap and a layer of oil in between. But what happens is, if the watch is given a shock, it can move. The balance can move. So the pivot will no longer break unless it's absolutely massive. And even then, if it's that big, typically this spring right here will pop out, right? So it's very rare that a balance will break like this. When I was working for Rolex, there was a Submariner that came in for a service. I found out that it belonged to someone in the army that was working on a helicopter and a winch system. His watch was caught in the steel rope going down, and it fell off of his wrist from about 50 feet. That watch dropped to the floor. The crystal was smashed. The lug was bent in a little bit, but the balance was perfect. So you may get some other things breaking, but it is very rare to actually get a balance staff to break. So let's just recap here. You've got the balance wheel, you've got a shock absorbing system, you have a regulating system that's giving impulse to the balance, along with your hairspring that is governing the speed of rotation. I'm going to talk about one thing. How do you adjust it? How do you adjust that speed? There's a part right here. You can see it here. This is called the pinning point. That's where the hairspring starts. It starts there and then also underneath here that you can't see. And it coils around to your spiral. This here, you can't really see it, but there's a gap. The hairspring goes through these 2 points, these 2 pins. So the hairspring sits in it like that. And so as it expands, it kind of touches on each side. That's called the regulator. As you move the regulator, you can make the rate speed up, or you can slow it down. This is how we do fast regulations. So this is a fairly standard thing that you will see in ETA, Soprod, Solita. Most watches have that. The reason for that is that it makes it very, very easy for the watchmaker to adjust the timekeeping on the watch. As long as everything is in balance, right, all you're worried about then is rate, right? Because you adjust the rate, it's going to adjust it in every position, right? But if you've got a heavy spot, you're going to have what's called a poise error, and that's going to go back to, one position being faster than another position. And it's got this really nice long arm, so you can actually tell how much you're pushing it for the watchmaker. On more advanced pieces, you have what's called a free sprung balance. It does not have this. It doesn't have that at all. All it is the hairspring going into the coil and swinging. You still need a way to be able to adjust the rate of that watch. And you do that with mass. So you do actually have some screws. In Rolex, you have 4 of them, 2 bigger than the other. They're always opposite each other. So 2 big screws opposite each other and 2 small screws opposite each other to be able to balance, right? And when you move those screws in closer to the balance rim or further away, that is how you're adjusting the rate of the watch. Omega does this as well. Rolex calls it the microstellar system. I can't remember what Omega calls it, but it is something that Rolex initially developed. You need a special tool to adjust it. Looks like this. So this little part here, if you can see it, hooks onto the little nut, star-shaped drilled hole in there, and that's how you turn it. And afterwards you can come up and have a look at it because it's got little lines on here so you can tell how much you're turning it by.
So, does that mean that if you're adjusting those screws, you have to do each side, would each side go in?
Exactly the same. No, so when you're adjusting one screw on one side, you have to adjust it by exactly the same amount on the other side. They have a big screw and a small screw because the big screw is a large mass, the small screw is a smaller mass, and so you can fine tune it with the smaller screw, but to make big jumps, use the big screw, right? And all you're doing is moving the mass closer or farther away from the balance, making the inertia there different. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you're just moving exactly. Very good.
Okay, so we just need moving the mass. What exactly what mass are you moving?
The screw is the mass.
The screw is the mass.
The screw is the mass. So if you put 2 screws opposite each other on a rotating balance, and they're perfectly balanced, that's great. And then if you move those screws towards the rim,
One in.
yeah, that's right, yeah.
And are they actually attached to the balance screw? What are they?
Yeah, there's a thread going through the balance rim, and they're actually attached to it. Yeah. But on simple systems like this is the regular thing that you will see with a regulator. So this is not a free sprung balance. This is a regulated balance using this. You move this needle here, that rotates along this curve here. And what it does is it effectively is shortening the hairspring. When you move it this way, that is the effective pinning point then, which will make the watch run fast. If you move it this way, there's more spring to be moving, which means that the balance is going to swing a little bit slower. But that then is the effective pinning point, not this. This is just where the hairspring is held at that point. But this can rotate all the way along this curve here and be able to adjust your time. And all things being equal, if the balance is actually balanced, you'll get very, very accurate timekeeping out of your watch in all positions. and easily adjustable.
Jason, so on balanced wheels that don't have the adjustable weights, but are imperfect,
Yeah.
does that mean are they just discarded or do you still repair them?
No, so the process is if a balance staff breaks, you have to replace it. A balance staff is riveted to the balance rim, the part you see swinging. Now, whenever you put a new rivet in, it's gonna add mass in a particular place. It won't be perfectly all the way around weight-wise, so you have to rebalance the balance to remove that weight, that excess weight. That requires micro drills to actually drill the balance and reduce weight. But when you reduce weight on a balance, there's less balance mass, and so the whole thing will run faster anyway. So you have to be very careful with that, because if you take too much weight off, then your balance weight will not match what your hairspring has been vibrated for, and this is what this tool is for. And we'll see this in the next slide. I'm not going to take a look at that in a minute, but you'll see it. When that happens, you know, you have to discard the balance. There's if you've taken too much mass off at that point in the repair, the balance is done. Every watch company has particular tolerances. On the far scale, you've got Seiko tolerances, right, that are -20, +20. On the Rolex scale, if you were at the chronometry talk, you'd understand that, you know, to be able to get a chronometer certificate, it has to reach a certain timing standard, -1 to +3 seconds in all positions and many temperatures, right? So this is where you can't let the balance get out of control, right? Because otherwise you'll start to go beyond those tolerances, right? So that's another big consideration with all of this. So here it's just showing you what happens on the pallet side. You know, the balance swings around, pushes the pallet fork this way, then it locks the gear train up. As it goes back the other way, it releases it, having given impulse to the balance to keep it going, and that's how it goes. Most watches have a 35 to 42 hour power reserve. That means that this system is going to be operating for that amount of time because of the mainspring. Mainspring power and length is fairly simple. However long the mainspring is, that's going to be your power reserve. How thick it is how strong that mainspring is actually going to be. So when we're replacing mainsprings, we don't necessarily have to get a Rolex mainspring. We have to get one that is the exact length and the exact thickness and the right height to be able to fit in the barrel, right? Pop it in, put the barrel cap on, so the barrel cap is seated nicely. If it's too high, the barrel cap won't go on. So this is how you do it. So you can use a generic mainspring. Rolex just goes to a mainspring manufacturer to make their mainsprings. And in some cases, they bought the mainspring manufacturer to make those things. Okay, so this is really neat because this is the tool that's over there. I will draw your attention to this and an arm here. If you remember back to a few minutes ago, I said, yeah, you know what? Watchmakers love hairsprings, but they go through a rite of passage to make them, right? The final part of making a hairspring is vibrating it, and that is to make sure that they've got the right length of hairspring for the required amplitude and vibration. So you remember I said 18,000, 19,000, 21,000, 28.8, and even 32,000. That's how rapidly that balance is going to be swinging. So you need a constant. You need a master balance where the hairspring is perfect, that you can then put your hairspring on that you've made with your balance that's perfectly balanced onto, to be able to match it up so the frequencies match up, right? Here the frequency matches up. If the balance, our watch balance on top, if it was rotating too fast, faster than that arm, then you know that, it's running fast. So the whole point in this exercise is to make sure that the timing is perfect with the device that is considered the master. And the master is just simply a master balance with a hairspring. You can see the screws. Now I took the white plate out here because these balances are weird. And that's what it is. So this is 18,000. And so you can still see the little black arm there, right? And this is the one I used through Watchmakers. I swore at this so many times. Yeah, and so did my instructor. So there, you can see it really closely. It's being held by tweezers. The hairspring is actually being held by tweezers. And that is where you've got that balance swinging perfectly in time with the master balance at that particular point where it's being gripped. That's like the same point when it's in the watch with the regulator. If the pins sit there, it's going to be perfect. And that is where the regulator always needs to be centered on the balance cock, the part that holds the balance in place, so that it doesn't look, so you've got room to move. The easiest way for me to describe that is, imagine having your bracelet adjusted on your watch bracelet, and you've got a micro adjust, and your bracelet's going into the micro adjust, but it's fully at one end, right? Either towards the tight end or the loose end. If you've got it towards the tight end and you've done it during winter, and in the summer your wrist swells up and you've got nowhere to go, right? You've got a problem. And this is the same with this and the regulator that's going to sit there, right? If you don't have it in the right place, you're going to have a problem.
Presumably when the hairspring's in the watch mechanism, it's flat, correct? So it's not elongated.
No, yeah, that's right, yeah.
For the testing, so are the properties, the tension properties the same when it's...
They're exactly the same. Exactly the same.
But then, so it's with a silicone hairspring, I wouldn't think that they would be, do they have to test the silicone hairspring this year?
No, they create the silicone hairspring based on weight, purely weight and length.
Okay.
Purely weight and length. All right, we're almost there. So like I said earlier, all of this is great, but you need to be able to see it, right? You need hands on it, so that we've got some kind of way to be able to tell the time. Remember I said the center wheel passes through the main plate, which is where your minute hand is attached. But you also have to be able to set your watch, and that is where the crown comes in. But before we go there for setting, I just want to talk here. So in between this and that, there's a plate. this, if you can imagine it, is your center wheel going through. There's its bearing surface. Attached then to the center wheel is a part that is called a cannon pinion. It's called a pinion because you can see the pinion, and you can see it's got a turret on it, which looks a bit like a cannon, hence cannon pinion. The nomenclature hasn't changed in all these years, right? And it's a friction fit, a loose friction fit. So as the center wheel rotates, this is going to rotate too. It cannot be hard fixed on the dial side, because then you wouldn't be able to set your watch minutes, right? So the whole purpose of this particular part is to enable you to be able to set your watch minutes. While the watch is running, it's still gripping enough so that your minute hand is going to be able to turn. On top of that, you have a second wheel, which is dropped on top of it. This is your hour wheel. And that is what your hour hand is attached to. All of this stuff you'll be able to see over here afterwards. It's that simple. Friction fit to the center wheel, and then you've got an hour wheel here, and then gearing to actually turn it. And this one, when it comes up, is it. Come on, come on. Yeah, there we go. So now you can see the gearing actually turning the cannon pinion here with the minute wheel, and then you can see the hour wheel. Notice the teeth on the minute wheel are interacting with the cannon pinion, and the pinion on the minute wheel is acting with the hour wheel. Ingenious, eh? And in order to change this from winding to setting, you have these gears here. So there's your crown up this end. As you rotate, you're rotating this pinion here. It has it has a wolf's tooth or crown and castle shaped tooth. So the two parts, this part here, see the shape of the teeth? And then when the part comes back, it's got very similar shaped teeth that it can lock into. That is what is doing the rotating for being able to wind the watch, to then being able to turn the gears to set the time. That's where your balance is. You can see it underneath here, and there's your shock absorbing system, that telltale hourglass style spring that's holding the jewels in place. On this particular watch, you've got an offset seconds. That is attached to an elongated shaft that is on your fourth wheel. So your fourth wheel turns once a minute. And that is how you manage to get an offset seconds. It is so simple. It is so absolutely simple, because a center seconds is much more complicated to make. So perhaps, when you look at the history of watchmaking, that's why offset seconds were first, because it's simple. Center seconds, that was most certainly a complication. But through pulling your stem with the crown, you're holding it in place here with this setting lever spring. Notice it's got notches on it. In this case, 2 notches, one there and one there. And it holds the gearing into place. This lever is interacting with the stem. So as you pull the stem, notice it rotates. There's a little notch that it goes into like this. And so when the stem is pulled, it's pulling that lever. The lever is clicking into the setting lever spring. How many of you have heard about a ghost set position, a ghost position? Many manufacturers make movements where there's one position, so you wind it, pull it out, one click, and it does nothing. And then you pull it out a second click, and then you set the time. It isn't the best of practices, but when you're a watch company manufacturing many movements, it makes sense, because that first position would be your quick set for your date. But for watches that don't have a date, right, using the same movement but less parts, right, but you can use one movement with a date and the same movement without a date, but you have that position. You'll never find that with a Halios watch, because Jason Lim absolutely loathes the ghost position and has purchased different setting levers, springs, for that reason. So every movement, that part has to be changed. But the same movement can be used to have a date, should you wish. So this is where there's flexibility. So now when somebody says, oh yeah, that ghost position, you'll remember this. It's got one more notch in it. I think we're there. What do you think?
Bravo.
Thank you very much for coming. And remember that all of this, every watchmaker has to go through, from the rudimentary part, the history part, the manufacturing part, to be able to understand this and be able to repair it. And it's a process. It really is a process, but it's so intriguing. And until you've actually had a chance to take a watch apart and try it and put it back together, that's where the real intrigue starts. How does your dexterity factor into this, right? So, one of the things that we're going to be doing shortly in the new year are bench experiences. So those of you that have ever wondered what it's actually like to take a watch apart, the watch that you'll be taking apart is the one that's on the bench there, in pieces, so you can actually see how many parts there are to it. So if you are interested, I'd urge you to go up and talk to Mary and Estefania, to put your name down on a list that she's going to create, so that we can have a chance to be able to do that. We would probably be doing it on a Sunday, and it would be 2 people at a time, because I have 2 benches. Unless the AWCI says, here's a portable bench that you can use for these things. But this is it. I really, really hope you've enjoyed this. And I really, really hope that it's helped demystify what goes on in the movement. And of course, at any time, if you come into the store during the week and you have a question and you just want to ask me about it, I'm more than open to talking and answering questions about that. And I'm around here now. I'm not leaving to go home afterwards. I've actually got work to do. But so if you want to ask questions now, you can do that too. Okay, thank you very much for coming. Thank you. Hello everyone, this is Jason, and I want to thank you for being with us today listening to the Roldorf Cafe podcast. You can hear more of our shows and when they're released on Instagram and our website. We cover many topics about watches, the industry, and the brands we're most passionate about. You can find the Roldorf shop at 307 West Cordova in Gastown in Vancouver, and we'd be delighted to welcome you and talk watches. Visit our website for more information at roldorf.co.